It's the 4th of July, which means it's time for fireworks. We're going to be in the backyard. We're going to be shooting off fireworks from a fantasy perspective here on our Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined here on the 4th of July by my co-host, Connor Benintendi, and a special thanks to all the 12s out there. Whether you're listening down in Redding, California, I apologize for the extreme heat that you're dealing with down there, or you're tuning in from Brazil. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week, and hope you and your family have an outstanding 4th of July. In the spirit of fireworks, we're going to be talking about fantasy football today, some projections from NFL.com. We're going to be looking at whether or not we agree with those projections on offense at the quarterback, running back, tight end, and receiver position. Plus, we'll continue our 90-man countdown as we dip into the 30s. We're getting closer to the top 25. This episode is going to be brought your way by our friends at FanDuel. Make every moment more as the playoffs are officially over. The sports stop sporting like we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking all customers with a boost or a bonus. That's right. There's something for everyone every day all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Now for your lead story here on our 4th of July holiday episode. We are nearing the start of the 2024 season, which means it's draft day. And I'm not talking about the supplemental draft. There actually isn't going to be one this year, the NFL has announced, but your fantasy football draft, which most football fans would agree is probably more important than the supplemental draft. You probably have as much of a chance these days of making an impact on fantasy football as you do in the supplemental draft. But I digress. Draft day is coming up. We're seeing all the projections coming out. So in honor of the 4th of July and talking fireworks, let's look at offensive fireworks, fantasy projections from NFL.com. And Connor, we're going to start at the quarterback position because, of course, you got to start first and foremost with the most important position in professional sports. And we saw what Geno Smith did last year. His touchdowns dipped from 30 in 2022 down to 20, but he cut his interceptions down a little bit, which may surprise some people with the way the season started. But he only had 2 picks his last 6 starts, was playing really good football. NFL.com does not seem to be quite as bullish on the idea that Geno Smith is going to have big numbers in Ryan Grubb's offense. Looking at the projections, 3,773 passing yards, 24 touchdowns, which would basically be in the middle of the last 2 seasons, and 11 interceptions, which would be a slight dip upwards compared to a year ago, and it would be right where he was at in 2022 in his comeback player of the year season.
Yeah, I think one of the big things that people are forgetting after this last year is that Geno also finished, at least in PPR leagues, as quarterback 5 in 2022. He was really effective just with the volume, passing yardage wise at 4,000, nearly 4,300 yards passing. The 30 touchdowns were huge for him in that regard, but he also had 366 yards rushing in 2022, adding a touchdown like he did in 2023. So, one of the interesting things too with this is that, Geno missed 2 games last year. And when you adjust his stats up to 17 games, he still finishes with over 4,000 passing yards and right around 23 touchdowns, about 10 interceptions. So I think if you get a full season out of Geno, this just feels a little bit too low in terms of what he can be in Ryan Grubb's offense, especially if, him and DK are able to get connect pretty consistently on those vertical routes and JSN breaks out and everything else. There's a lot more potential maybe than there was in Shane Waldron's offense last year. And I think Geno bounces back a little bit. This has him finishing at QB 24. Unless you're in a 2-quarterback league, that means Geno's mostly riding the bench. So I think he's going to be a little bit higher than this. Probably somewhere in between his 2022 and 2023 season, but a little bit closer to 2022 than he was in that projection.
And I'm bullish on him putting up the best numbers of his career in this offense. And listen, this is a prediction that I made a month and a half ago, and I'm going to keep sticking with it. I think Geno Smith is going to surpass the 30 touchdown passes that he had 2 years ago. And my rationale as we go through this exercise today, when you just look at the amount of talent that Ryan Grubb is going to have to be able to scheme open, and Jaxon Smith-Njigba, the high expectations going into year 2, I still think Tyler Lockett is a very good receiver, and he's probably your number 3 receiver at this point. With all those pieces, if they can just get a little more consistency and better health up front, that is going to be the key. But I think 4,000 plus passing yards and 30 plus touchdown passes is doable. The interceptions, we might see that go into the 12, 13 range just because there's going to be more shots downfield. That's just going to be what Ryan Grubb wants, and that's going to lead to a few more picks along the way. But I think you're going to see also a lot more of those explosive pass plays downfield. And I think the red zone, they're going to be more effective, which means more touchdowns, hopefully, for Geno Smith. So I'm bullish on him doing much better than this. And ranking 24th on NFL.com's rankings, rookie J.J. McCarthy is just behind him. I see no way that these two guys this year, at least, are in the same department. I don't know that McCarthy's even going to start to open the season. It might be Sam Darnold time in Minnesota first. So that's the way I'm looking at this. It seems way too low for me. Let's go to some of the players that are going to be in the backfield taking handoffs from Geno Smith, continuing our fantasy preview here. And Ken Walker III, last year he missed the 1,000-yard mark after rushing for over 1,000 yards his rookie year. NFL.com does not see him getting above that 1,000-yard mark again this season, getting to 970, 7 rushing touchdowns, 29 receptions. So basically, Connor, they're looking at Ken Walker III having eerily similar numbers to what he had last year. I mean, this is almost identical to his numbers from 2023.
Yeah. And you know, Corbin, the one thing for me is that this is still the hardest position group to predict, in my opinion, just especially, you know, raw production, fantasy, however you want to look at it, it's the most difficult position for me to predict just because, you know, this is also projecting Zach Charbonnet to see an uptick in production. And, you know, I think that that's a realistic expectation, just given the fact that we know Ryan Grubb likes to run between the tackles. And that's going to be something that we're going to see a lot from this offense. But Ken Walker last year was RB19. The year before that, he was RB18, crossed 1,000 yards rushing in 2022, but he fell short of that in 2023. But he did have over 1,000 scrimmage yards last year. And I think that you're going to see that again. This has him at RB17 for 2024. And that just feels like, I think if Ken Walker finished at RB17 and with these numbers, we're not seeing much of an improvement going into year 3. And I think that would disappoint a lot of fans overall, just with what our expectations are for him from a talent perspective. I would think that he's going to see a little bit more of a jump. I think Zach Charbonnet is going to see a little bit more of a jump. But, you know, as you said before the show, there's only one football to go around, and Ryan Grubb's going to have to figure out the best way to distribute that football.
Yeah, and the reason why I'm not going to push back as much at this projection, do I think there's a good chance Ken Walker gets past 1,000 yards? Yes, I think that there is a good chance, especially if the passing game is humming the way that I think it's going to be. Teams are not going to be able to stack the box. That's just going to be the way that goes. It's going to open up more running lanes for Ken Walker III, but it's the Zach Charbonnet presence. And we had Danny Kelly on the show early this week, and he was kind of talking about how Zach Charbonnet compares more to Dylan Johnson, who had 1,000+ yards last year for Washington and Ryan Grubb's offense. And I think when you look at Charbonnet's skill set, he isn't the boom or bust runner that Ken Walker III can be at times. He is more that deliberate downhill hammer. I'm going to get the yards that are in front of me, but he still has the ability to break runs, even if he's not quite as explosive as Ken Walker III. He had almost as many 10+ yard runs last year with a far smaller workload. So they're projecting 575 rushing yards. That'd be more than 100 more than what he had last year for rushing touchdowns. And they're picking him to have 33 catches, more than they have for Ken Walker III. And that's probably going to be because he's going to see more snaps on third down because he's a better pass protector. So I'm not going to push back at the idea that Ken Walker III is not going to be able to put those kind of numbers up, or is going to be able to put up more numbers than that, just because of that Zach Charbonnet handcuff that could be there, where he might get a bigger percentage of the reps. And in the end, the Seahawks may have a much more effective ground game overall, but they're not going to have a guy that's going to be in the top 5 or 6 in rushing. Then that's not necessarily a bad thing, especially in today's NFL. You want to have productive rushing, and it doesn't matter who's going to give you those yards, how you're going to get those yards. But it feels like Charbonnet could be a guy that Ryan Grubb has confidence in and ends up giving him more opportunities maybe than some other offensive coordinators would in their respective schemes. So it does feel like this could be a situation, especially in the goal line situations. Maybe Ken Walker III doesn't get to 7 touchdowns because Charbonnet could be the guy that comes in short yardage because of his running style. And so you could have a touchdown vulture on your hands there from a fantasy football perspective. And I think those are all things that we have to consider when we are talking about the Seahawks backfield situation. As we mentioned with the scheme the other day, the player usage or the back usage, that is going to be a little bit of a mystery going into this season as well. And we aren't going to know where things stand until the season actually begins in September. Coming up next, we're going to continue our fireworks fantasy display here, going to the receiver and tight end positions. What is NFL.com projecting for Tyler Lockett, Noah Fant and company? We'll get to those numbers here in a moment on our Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode of Locked On Seahawks is brought your way by Game Time. You shouldn't have to think about skipping a mortgage payment when you want to buy tickets to your next big event. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater near you. They've got killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their best price guarantee. Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. Back in April, my wife and I scored amazing seats to watch the Avalanche and the Jets in the 5th row near center ice, and we got those tickets for under $125. While Colorado got clobbered, it was still blast. We did have to pay an arm and a leg for amazing seats between 2 prospective playoff teams. Game Time has deals on tickets right up to the day of the event, and the Game Time guarantee means you'll always get the best price to write your own memories. If you find tickets in the same section and row for less, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. You're listening to the Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined for our 4th of July show by my co-host, Connor Benintendi. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week, especially on holidays. We greatly appreciate it. We're taking a deep dive into fantasy projections on offense. A little bit of fireworks from a fantasy perspective today. We've already looked at the quarterback position. We discussed Zach Charbonnet and Ken Walker III at running back. Now we're going to get to the position that really inspires the most excitement when you're talking about fantasy, and that is the receiver position. And this may be a spot from individual standpoint that fans maybe are going to be a little bit disappointed from the standpoint that you've got so many mouths to feed that you might not have an elite fantasy receiver on this roster. But at the same time, you could maybe pick up 2 or 3 of these Seahawk receivers, and together you could have a really formidable fantasy receiving core, starting with DK Metcalf, who, at least in my opinion, is still going to be the leader of this group in terms of yardage and touchdowns. I don't know if he leads the team in receptions, but I think the big plays that he generates and the fact that he has been a consistent threat in the end zone, I expect those to hold true in Ryan Grubb's offense. And that seems to be the way that things are shaping up with the projections as well. Only 74 catches, but 8 touchdowns, equaling last year's output.
Yeah, like Danny was saying on the show yesterday, or on Tuesday, DK is really going to fill that sort of Rome Odunze role that Grubb had at Washington. And then you're going to have JSN filling the role of probably a Jalen McMillan, just as a speedy, elusive slot guy who can kind of attack that deep middle third of the field. Also can kind of be the dump off guy if needed, if things aren't looking good, down the field for Geno. I don't see DK getting pushed out of the top spot. The constant discourse with Seattle's receivers, specifically from a fantasy standpoint, is none of them are super relevant because none of them get the production to be a true wide receiver one, right? They're not going to fill that role of a Tyreek Hill or a Jamar Chase or a Justin Jefferson. DK is not going to be that. And that's okay, because at the end of the day, DK is going to do what he needs to do in the offense. He's going to produce for Seattle, but he probably is going to finish right around, which is what NFL has him projected as, at wide receiver 17. That seems like a pretty good spot. Somewhere between 15 and 20 is where he has finished. You look at the past 3 seasons, and he was wide receiver 14 in 2021, wide receiver 16 in 2022, and in 2023 he was wide receiver 21. But last year was a pretty good year for wide receivers. The big thing is, I think JSN leapfrogs Tyler Lockett, and I don't think there's really any question about that. We've seen Tyler slowly sort of decline, and I think that's going to continue, especially just with the usage that JSN could be getting in this offense overall. I still think that JSN cracks 1,000 yards this year. I don't think that I think these projections are too low for Smith-Njigba. I think he's going to be a true number 2 wide receiver, both from a fantasy perspective and from a raw production perspective.
Yeah, we're in agreement on both of those things. And I've already been on the record saying this on the show. I've been on the record on my segment on KJR with Ian Furness that I think that Jaxon Smith-Njigba is going to lead this team in receptions. I am sold on him in this offense. And listen, I don't try to put too much stock in offseason programs, but I just feel like this guy is way better than his rookie numbers showed last year. And Danny Kelly was talking about this. It didn't feel like there was really a plan in to take advantage of the talent that Jaxon Smith-Njigba has. And I don't expect at all that Ryan Grubb's going to have a problem with that. He knows how to handle having 3 stud receivers. He did it at Washington. Jaxon Smith-Njigba, I think 1,000 yards is very doable for him, and I could also see him getting 90-plus catches in this offense. That's the type of threat that he is in this scheme. All those chances in the middle, they're going to give him a chance to make plays downfield too, which we saw him do several times last year in a season that I felt like was solid but not great. I'm really excited to see what he can do. So 68 catches, not even getting to 800 receiving yards seems way too low to me. Of all the projections we're going to go through, this is the one. And maybe it ends up being that he doesn't take that leap forward, but I would be stunned if he doesn't. I really think that this kid is primed for a breakout year. I just think these stats are way too low. And that lends itself to Tyler Lockett. And I still think Tyler Lockett is a really solid NFL receiver. 4 straight 1,000-yard seasons, just missed getting there again last year in a year that wasn't quite up to his usual standards. I would tend to be more in agreement with NFL.com's projection here because I can't see 3 receivers getting to 900-plus yards in this offense. Maybe Lockett gets into the 850 range and gets about 70 catches. The touchdowns would be the area that I still maybe look at, might be a little bit low. They're picking 5 here. I could see JSN having a ton of catches, a ton of yards, but maybe only scoring 5 or 6 touchdowns. I am confident in Tyler Lockett's ability to still be able to take the top off of defense, and he's always been sneaky good in the red zone, getting away from people. It's almost like defenders lose him in the crowd, and he scores a lot of touchdowns. So 5 seems a little bit low for me. I could see him being a less volume guy now at the stage of his career, but still providing effectiveness and efficiency, catching touchdowns in this offense.
Yeah, I would go on the record and say that I think he's going to finish south of 800 yards. And I think that that's going to be a pretty hard line. Maybe he might even finish south of 700 yards. And that's purely just because if we're expecting a larger sample size for Noah Fant, which I think a lot of fans are hoping for, but it's not obviously a guarantee. And we're expecting JSN to jump up, DK to have at least 1,000 yards. I just feel like Tyler ends up being the odd man out in this offense, as crafty and as good as he's been throughout his career. And this is just my opinion, of course. I just don't think he's going to have quite the season that fans are expecting. And honestly, there's kind of that joke in fantasy football, at least surrounding Tyler Lockett, that, he's kind of that guy that somebody slots into their flex spot and he ends up popping off for 30 points or whatever and suddenly winning the game and nobody expected it. And Tyler Lockett's kind of been that guy throughout his career. It's, all of a sudden he'll have a 3 catch for 40-yard game, and the next game he has 3 touchdowns. You just don't know what to expect from him. So he could prove me wrong. Truly, I hope he does. But I think that we see a continued decline, at least production-wise, for Tyler.
And normally we would have just done the first 3 receivers, but I think Jake Bobo at least warrants a brief look. And it's interesting because NFL.com's got him eclipsing his numbers from last year. 25 catches, 307 yards, 2 touchdowns. And I don't know that you and I are in agreement on this, but I could see Jake Bobo getting to those numbers and maybe getting more than 2 touchdowns just because of how crafty he is, the soft hands, Geno Smith has a very strong chemistry with him. We saw his ability in the red zone on those couple touchdowns he scored last year, and it felt like they kind of got away from using him in the second half. I still think that there is a role here for Jake Bobo to be able to get you 25 catches, 250 to 300 or so receiving yards. And again, maybe Tyler Lockett loses a few of his receptions in that regard. But I just think Ryan Grubb holds Jake Bobo. He holds a lot of respect for him dating back to when Jake Bobo torched Washington's defense with UCLA, and he got a front row seat to that. He knows the kind of player he is. So, again, I'm not expecting a huge jump. There's only one football, but I could see Bobo having a little better numbers than he did last year.
Yeah, I think he's just kind of that utility wide receiver that it's going to be interesting to see what they do with him. Obviously, if they want to run the ball, they're probably going to put him out the outside and let him block a whole lot, which, I just don't know how many targets he's going to get. I think the volume is going to be the biggest question mark for him, and whether he can get to those numbers. So I struggle to come to a full decision on where I'm at on Jake Bobo right now. I'd like to see training camp, and then we can go from there, see kind of how many reps he's getting, where his role is fitting in this offense. But I think right now I'm gonna agree with you, just in the sense that I think that is kind of his ceiling, and I could see it happening.
Let's go to the tight end position real quick. And we're only going to look at one player here because A.J. Barner, I believe, was like 60-something on the fantasy projections. He's not a guy that was known for catching a lot of passes in college. I don't expect him to suddenly become a volume tight end catcher in the NFL, at least as a rookie. And Pharaoh Brown has never been that player. Jack Westover maybe has fantasy value if he makes this football team and finds a way to be on offense. But for right now, we don't know if that's going to be the case. Noah Fant, though, you gave him $10.5 million per year in a 2-year contract after scoring no touchdowns last year. NFL.com has him finding the end zone 3 times. So they're not looking at a massive jump, though. I mean, that's a significant improvement from having 0 last year. But 364 receiving yards, 35 receptions. To be frank with you, this speaks that the fantasy community is not keen on the idea that Noah Fant is suddenly going to be significantly more productive, because that would be less receiving yards than he had last year. You're going to get more touchdowns, which of course has more fantasy value. But again, we're just looking at all these different players the Seahawks have to get the football to, and it's hard to envision that there's going to be a major improvement in how many receptions and targets in general that Noah Fant is going to get in this offense. And we know tight ends were involved at Washington at the same time, though. It does feel like there's a little bit more skepticism on my front that they're going to be able to, and I don't know that it's smart to be trying to manufacture too many targets for him with the receivers they have. If there's injuries, that's one thing, but smart business with this team, it seems like most of your targets should be going to those stud receivers that you have.
Yeah, this was probably the biggest head-scratching contract of the offseason. Not because Noah Fant's not a good player. It's just that we don't know what his true pass-catching ability is with Seattle. I mean, like I was talking to you before the show, in Denver, he had a season where he finished as tight end 8 in fantasy. And even then, he was falling below expectations, at least just from a non-fantasy perspective as a pass-catching tight end. Last year he finished as tight end 32, which is really low, basically not fantasy relevant whatsoever. Probably not even stashed on anybody's bench. And that was because of the lack of touchdowns. In 2022, he had 4 touchdowns. He was tight end 17. That means, he's kind of in that, my tight end's on bye, I'm going to go pick up Noah Fant and plug him in and hope he does something, right? Just to get anything on my in my matchup for me. But it's interesting because, like you also said, Corbin, tight ends were involved at Washington, but not in a high volume role. And I just don't see that happening for Noah Fant necessarily. That should hopefully increase Tyler Lockett's targets a little bit. But that remains to be seen. And, one of the biggest things that stuck out to me about Noah Fant's stats from last year is just the 20 less targets too. He was on the field less overall, 20 less targets. His yards per catch were up, which is interesting. But he just saw the football a whole lot less. And I don't know if Ryan Grubb's going to increase that volume in 2024.
Yeah, that's another one of the big questions going to this season. If he plays a lot more snaps, though, that's naturally going to create more target opportunities. So with this revamped tight end group, that may very well be the case. And I expect a lot more one tight end personnel than what we saw with Shane Waldron too. And he's going to be that one tight end a lot of the time. When we come back, we're going to continue our 90-man countdown. We're going into the 30s, including a couple of newcomers on offense and defense. Don't go away. You're listening to the Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Welcome back to the Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined for today's show by my co-host, Connor Benintendi, and a happy 4th of July to all of our valued listeners. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. Let's transition to our 90-man countdown. We'll have a little bit of fantasy implications maybe here. I highly doubt it with any of the players we're going to be talking about here, but we're going to start off with one of Seattle's under-the-radar defensive additions, a player that may have an opportunity to play that third safety role for the Seahawks this year. And in Mike Macdonald's defense, I know Pete Carroll the last few years has been talking so much about wanting to get 3 safety looks and injuries and then inconsistent usage. We just never saw that come to fruition the way that I think he wanted to. Mike Macdonald's got a proven track record, though, of playing 3 safeties, and he wants 3 safeties that can play both positions. Kavon Wallace offers that. And last year was a really weird year for him, Connor, because he was with the Eagles in training camp, then he gets cut. He signs with the Arizona Cardinals later in the season. He gets cut. Tennessee Titans sign him. He finished out the season. So he was with 3 teams. He played games for 2 teams last year. And yet he had easily his most productive season as a pro, whether you're looking at raw numbers, if you're looking at PFF grades. And watching the film, I saw a guy that played a pretty good game against the Seahawks in Nashville when he was with the Titans. I thought he looked fairly solid in his reps replacing Budda Baker in the Cardinals secondary. I see a solid football player, and yet he couldn't keep a job last year. That positional flexibility, he's played slot, he's played both safety positions, and last year he played all 3 of those spots. I thought he played all of them at a pretty high level for the most part, despite the fact that he was a journeyman bouncing around with multiple teams. And it feels like at a low price that this is a guy that you may be able to get pretty good investment there in terms of what he is going to provide your defense, coming up and making some tackles, making a few plays in the football. Not going to get a bunch of interceptions, but he's kind of got that gritty playing style that I think Mike Macdonald really wants on his defense in general, and it'll be a good fit with his versatility.
Yeah, the versatility is the biggest thing, especially when right now Jarek Reed's injury is still such a big unknown, and we don't know, if we're going to see him in training camp, if we're going to see him in the preseason. We just don't know where his injury is at right now, and I think that's the biggest thing benefiting Kavon Wallace in terms of the reps that he's going to get, especially in training camp and the preseason. And the versatility just allows him to play anywhere. We know Mike Macdonald, like you said, likes to play 3 safeties whenever he goes into nickel and dime packages. And I think Kavon Wallace is the perfect fit to slide in as that third safety. Now, the other thing is Kobe Bryant and Jarek Reed are potentially also the perfect fit to slide in those packages. So it's going to be kind of a toss-up in that regard, and just how Mike Macdonald feels about what their skill set lends and their versatility overall as players. But he has a lot of upside. He's only 26 years old. There's still a lot of unknowns with Kavon Wallace and what he can become overall as a safety in the NFL. So I like his chances to potentially be the third safety, but the worst case scenario also sees him pretty much being a special teams player exclusively.
Let's go to special teams now. And honestly, this has been what I've been really excited about talking about, just because Jason Myers, our colleague Nick Lee, wrote an article about this yesterday on All Seahawks. And I don't think I've ever seen a bigger discrepancy from a player at any position in my entire life than what Jason Myers has had at the kicker position in even versus odd years. In odd years, he's making less than 78% of his field goals since the Seahawks signed him. In even years, he's making north of 93%. And guess what? It's July 4th, 2024. It is an even year, so special teams fantasy owners rejoice. Jason Myers may have a lot of value to you this year. History suggests that he is going to have a fantastic season. And the thing is, I used to laugh at these splits when it was like 2 or 3 years. I'm like, it's just a coincidence. But here we are now, and we have gotten to see Jason Myers play 4 full seasons. Actually, I believe 5 full seasons in Seattle. We have gotten to see the Jekyll and Hyde thing that is even odd splits. And like, it's insane. And last year was especially weird because he wasn't as bad as he was in 2021 when he only made 73% of his kicks. He was awful in 2021 after not missing anything in 2020. I mean, it was, again, Jekyll and Hyde. Last year, this was the first time in his career he had not missed an extra point, but his field goals, he was not great. He was below his career average. So you still had that poor odd year fitting in there, at least by his standards. You got to be excited it's an even year. And at this point, I'm not looking at this as a small sample size anymore. It's just like, I don't know what it is, but, maybe give him contracts from here on out. Hey, odd years, we're going to let you go on a sabbatical. We're going to sign somebody else. We'll bring you back in your even year. I don't know what it is, Connor, but it's just baffling to me.
Yeah, it's very peculiar when you look at his stats, and it's not subtle whatsoever. And I think that's the funny part about it. The last even year he played in 2022, he was the NFL scoring leader. I mean, it's ridiculous. And then he drops off in 2023. I mean, I'm also still shocked he survived that 2021 season without getting cut. I'm glad he didn't because I like Jason Myers. And generally, whenever he steps up, for anything, especially inside the 40-yard line, I feel pretty confident that it's going through the uprights. But honestly, that's really all I've really got to say about him, except for the fact that I'm excited it's 2024 and it's not 2025. That's really where I'm at.
It's insane when you have almost a 20% gap between even and odd years. Again, like I said, I just never seen splits like that for anybody. I mean, I know kickers regress and there's a lot of sporadic numbers in terms of year to year, but he's just on another planet in that regard. So again, thank goodness it's 2024. And let's go back to the quarterback position. And PJ Walker, listen, he is not one of the top 40 players on Seattle's roster, but because he's signed late after the conclusion of OTAs and was only on the field for minicamp, we didn't get him into this countdown where he most likely would have sat. That doesn't mean that he can't be a player that's a useful addition, though, because we're talking about a guy that has started 9 games, and I know he's completed less than 50% of his passes last year. I mean, he is not a polished passer by any means, way more interceptions than touchdowns. But he also, when you're a backup and you don't get the reps in practice, it's really hard to go out and play good football. And yet he was able to help the Cleveland Browns beat the San Francisco 49ers last year. They almost beat the Seahawks at Lumen Field. He threw for over 250 yards in that game. And there are plays that you see, you're like, he's got some potential, but he just hasn't been able to put it together when he's had his chances. Still, he started almost 10 games in the league. He's got dual threat capability. And I think with the NFL's rule they adopted last year where you can keep a third quarterback, an emergency QB, that doesn't count against your 46-man count, I don't know why you wouldn't take advantage of that, because all it takes is just one of those fluky games where Geno Smith and Sam Howell both get banged up in the same game behind a suspect offensive line. And who do you have playing quarterback then? Is Ken Walker III just taking wildcat snaps from there? You need to have somebody else who can play, and PJ Walker could give you that flexibility. I think could warrant a spot in the 53, especially if he plays well in the preseason in Ryan Grubb's offense.
Yeah, I think I'm glad that he's our third string quarterback and not our immediate backup, because he is a premium third string quarterback. I mean, the reason most people know PJ Walker was from that crazy 64-yard Hail Mary that he threw against the Falcons back in, I think, 2022. And one of the wildest endings to a game where it was, I think, the longest air completion in the NFL Next Gen Stats era or whatever, which is, back to 2016. And then they ended up losing the game on the missed extra point after the penalty, which that's where most people learned who PJ Walker was, because it was like, this play was insane. Right. But at the end of the day, he has not been even really a serviceable backup. I mean, he did okay in terms of wins and losses with Cleveland, like you said, Corbin, but 1 touchdown to 5 interceptions and south of a 50% completion percentage is not what you want as a primary backup. Where he's at, I'm excited that Seattle has him, because if for some reason we had to go to our third quarterback, I would feel better with PJ Walker in there than, say some unproven rookie who's never seen an NFL football field. And that at least provides some level of insurance for Seattle. Hopefully we never get there. Hopefully we never have to see PJ Walker, playing on Sundays in the regular season. But overall, this is just a good signing, especially for the contract that they got him. Stash him, let him play in training camp, see how he looks. You don't have to bring him back next year, but at least for 2024, he's a good serviceable third string quarterback.
As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Connor at CJohnBenintendi on X. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. When we come back for Blue Friday, we're going to be continuing our training camp previews, and we're finally going to get to that off-ball linebacker position. We'll be building off our conversation that we had with former All-Pro Lofa Tatupu. Make sure that you are listening in and enjoy the rest of your Thursday and your 4th of July holiday. Go Hawks.